Recent arts and culture sessions have featured the former U.S. Poet Laureate, Kay Ryan at one, the National Endowment for the Humanities Chair, Jim Leach at another. And of course, it is a very, very big thrill to have Elizabeth Alexander back at an Aspen event. I don't know if how many of you might have been there, but we had Elizabeth at the Ideas Festival a few years ago, and it was just enormously exciting for everyone who was there. I will leave the introduction to our distinguished guest to our also extraordinarily distinguished moderator, whom I will now introduce. We are absolutely delighted to have Ethelbert Miller here. Ethelbert is really one of the central figures of Washington literary life and culture. And I don't mean by that Beltway culture, I mean really active, live, thriving culture of the District of Columbia. A poet and a literary activist, he has served in an extraordinary number of public roles, formerly the Poet Laureate of the district, the former chairman of the Humanities Council of Washington, of course, the editor of Poet Lore, which I think is the longest continuously published journal of poetry in the United States, the board chair of the Institute of Policy Studies, and the longtime director of Howard's African American Resource Center. In addition to all of these incredible public responsibilities, somehow he has found time to write, I think, 10 volumes of poetry. He's taught widely, and so we are thrilled. He has also played a special role as a mentor to young poets, and I'm sure one of the more interesting things we'll hear this afternoon is about his experience in doing that to our guest, whom he has known since her teenage years. So we are thrilled to have such distinguished poets with us today. This is going to be videotaped, so I ask you to turn off things like Blackberries and also know that this will have a life for a long time on our website, so you can encourage your friends to come and listen to that. And with all of that, I'm just going to turn things over to you, Ethelbert. And thank you again, all of you, for coming. We look forward to you coming back to many other sessions here at Aspen.
Thank you very much. When I think of Elizabeth Alexander, the first word that comes to mind is the word fabulous. I think this word describes the woman and her work. It's a word that captures the arc of her success and the word that many young writers whisper after meeting her for the first time. I've always loved Elizabeth Alexander. I love her family, her mother and father. So it's easy to slip into a praise song for the day. When I was asked to write a book blurb for the Venus Hottentot, her first collection of poems, I made the following comment. The poetry of Elizabeth Alexander embraces ancestry, innocence, love, music, art, heroes, and history. I like how Alexander writes. I like what she's writing about. There is enough intellectual magic in this collection to keep a civilization of critics talking for years. 2 decades after her first book, I introduce a woman who is an award-winning poet. I introduce a woman who is chair of the Department of African American Studies at Yale University. I introduce a woman who has written plays and essays. I introduce a woman at a major turning point in American history who shared her words with the world. Elizabeth Alexander is a woman who will introduce you to deeper studies. Read her books and be pulled into her dreams. Gray Wolf has blessed us with such titles as Antebellum Dream Book and Body of Life. The genius of Alexander can be found in her book of essays, The Black Interior. I like to believe that Elizabeth Alexander, the mother as well as the poet, has given birth to brightness, that after such political and cultural darkness surrounding us and our souls have been given back their sight. When we read or hear her words, we can only say, fabulous. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you, Ethelbert.
I want to ask you this first question because you're not just a writer but also a teacher. And I was wondering, how would you teach the poem, Praise Song for the Day, that you read at the President Obama's inauguration? What might a student need to know in order to fully appreciate and comprehend the poem?
That is a great question, and I'm not at all surprised. I think I would ask my students first to think about the conditions of the creation of the poem. Why did it come into the world? Well, it came into the world with work to do, with a job to do, and it came in the world to be read out, perhaps never to be read on paper. So how does that knowledge affect the work that a student does looking at the poem on paper? And we would think about that first. Then I think I would ask them, as I ask my students to do, to literally look at it and notice things, to notice the shape, to notice the choices, to notice the stanzaic regularity, to notice that one line that breaks free at the end of the poem, and to see what they would have to say about that. I would ask for a show of hands, who knows what a praise song is, and then we would talk about what does it mean for a West African art form to make its way into an American context. What does it therefore mean for a African-American art form to be at the center of an American moment in history, which would, I think, also become a way to think about the moment that we're in history. And then we would just move through line by line and look at the images. And remember, it's surprising to me how many people, because a lot of people saw the inaugural, say to me, I liked your speech. And I think that that's because most people think that they are not familiar with listening to a poem. So that's what the act was, somebody getting up behind a podium in front of a lot of people, a speech. And so I think maybe by looking at and thinking about some of the images, we would be able to both pull out whatever they saw in the poem, and that's what's interesting, as you know, about any poem that we write. We send them out into the world. We send them out with intent. We send them out hopefully with clarity, but we absolutely have no idea what people are going to do with them, find in them, see in them, and that is one of the privileges of being a poet and putting your work out there. But to think about what is it that a poem can do that not only a speech does not do, but that the speeches that surrounded it in its original context weren't there to do. So that would get us to thinking about the hopefully both exalted and plain speech of poetry, the particular speech of poetry, its particular magic, and how it does something that political language usually doesn't.
Could you share the poem with us?
Sure, absolutely. And then I'd have them read it out. And I would ask them about the different settings in which we receive poetry. So what does it mean to hear this poem on television or on the mall? What does it mean then, as we will now, to hear this poem in a very, very intimate space? And what would it mean to take in the poem as a reader silently to yourself? Those being some of the different ways that you could encounter it. So, praise song for the day. Each day we go about our business, walking past each other, catching each other's eyes or not, about to speak or speaking. All about us is noise. All about us is noise and bramble, thorn and din, each one of our ancestors on our tongues. Someone is stitching up a hem, darning a hole in a uniform, patching a tire, repairing the things in need of repair. Someone is trying to make music somewhere with a pair of wooden spoons on an oil drum, with cello, boombox, harmonica, voice. A woman and her son wait for the bus. A farmer considers the changing sky. A teacher says, "Take out your pencils, begin." We encounter each other in words, words spiny or smooth, whispered or declaimed, words to consider, reconsider. We cross dirt roads and highways that mark the will of someone, and then others who said, "I need to see what's on the other side. I know there's something better down the road. We need to find a place where we are safe. We walk into that which we cannot yet see." Say it plain that many have died for this day. sing the names of the dead who brought us here, who laid the train tracks, raised the bridges, picked the cotton and the lettuce, built brick by brick the glittering edifices they would then keep clean and work inside of. Praise song for struggle, praise song for the day. Praise song for every hand-lettered sign, the figuring it out at kitchen tables. Some live by love thy neighbor as thyself. Others by first do no harm or take no more than you need. What if the mightiest word is love? Love beyond marital, filial, national. Love that casts a widening pool of light. Love with no need to preempt grievance. In today's sharp sparkle, this winter air, anything can be made, any sentence begun. On the brink, on the brim, on the cusp. Praise song for walking forward in that light.
Now, you know, Elizabeth, thank you. We're all sitting here with this poem. You know what the next question is.
I don't.
When you look at the poem today, do you see places where you would do some revision?
No, you know me better than that. No. Done is done, or else you will go crazy. I mean, although I do think that poets fall into two camps. You know, Robert Hayden, whose work we esteem so highly, was anxious about poems for decades after he wrote them. Changed little tiny things for decades. I'm not made like that. When the poem is done, it's got to be done. And I think what's been interesting in putting together this new and selected poems and looking back over 20 years of work and looking at work that I wrote when I was a whole nother person, I think it's important to be able to see who you were aesthetically, creatively, emotionally, everything that goes into the poem at a particular moment in time. And to let that stand as a record.
Okay.
And to let development happen.
Okay. What makes a poem an Elizabeth Alexander poem and not something written by someone else? Do you have your own sound?
Oh my goodness. I guess so. I do think, I'm not dodging it, I think that's a question for the readers. But I hope that in all of the poems there is a combination of, they are deeply well read. So there's a lot of historical and literary material in them. There's a sense of literary form, but also they're poems that were written with ears wide open. So the rhythms of vernacular speech, of the ways that people communicate with each other, and of music are always informing every single word, every single syllable actually, that goes onto the page.
Okay. In your collection, Body of Life, there are a number of prose poems. How comfortable are you when using this form? What has to work in a prose poem for you?
Well, when I wrote, Body of Life is my second book. My first book I wrote coming out of a master's program where I studied with the only poetry teacher I ever had, the poet Derek Walcott. Great poet, Nobel winner, St. Lucia, blah, blah. A very, very, very strict formalist in his teaching. So he's not interested in lines that go beyond iambic pentameter. He's interested in shapes that are discernible, that have literary lineage. Even though, of course, for those of you who know his poetry, the ear is paramount. These are poems of St. Lucia. These are poems that don't sound like they come from anyplace else. So I think that with that second book, those prose poems I really felt like were a breaking away from teacher. Because I remember writing those poems and thinking, he's not going to like that. Because he would say, that's not a poem. But the sense of what would it mean to hold on to a cloud of language, to make a terse and beautiful and energized cloud of language when you did not have lineation, line breaking at your disposal, seemed a very, very interesting challenge to me. So how to have that kind of dynamism in the poem when you don't have the space and the air and the breath of the line break, which is one of the best tools we have as poets. That was the challenge.
Could you read one of your prose poems?
Sure. I didn't know he was going to ask me that, otherwise I would have had one at the ready.
Well, we like the dramatic effect.
That's right, exactly. Okay. This is called What I'm Telling You. My dad's in it. My actual dad. What I'm telling you. If I say my father was Betty Shabazz's lawyer, the poem can go no further. I've given you the punchline. If you know who she is, all you can think about is how and what you want to know. About me, about my father, about Malcolm, especially in 1990 when he's all over T-shirts and medallions. But what I'm telling you is that Mrs. Shabazz was a nice lady to me, and I loved her name for the wrong reasons. Shabazz. And what I remember is going to visit her daughters in 1970 in a dark house with little furniture and leaving with a candy necklace the daughters gave me to keep. Now that children see his name and call him Malcolm 10, and someone called her Mrs. X's, and they don't really remember who he was or what he said or how he smiled the way it happened when it did, and neither do I. I think about how history is made more than what happened, and about a nice woman in a dark house filled with daughters and candy, something dim and unspoken, expectation.
This next question is connected to the prose poem. What fiction writers have influenced your poetry?
Well, Toni Morrison would be the queen, I think. Such an extraordinary and both jagged and lyrical fiction writer, and such a compressed fiction writer that even when she's stretching out and telling us these long, elaborate stories, that the condensation of her language and her use of imagery really feels. She's written a few poems, as you know, but didn't start out as a poet, but I feel like I'm in a poet's hands when I read her work, and just that sense, which I would hope to convey in a poem, that underneath the surface of the work itself is a universe, so that what the writer is presenting, in the case of Toni Morrison, any paragraph has just tentacles and universes and all kinds of things swimming underneath it. I think is really extraordinary. So she's someone who I return to over and over again. Also because I sometimes, probably because of having a poet's mind, get a little bit impatient with fiction when there's too much. I started out writing fiction, as you know, and journalism as well. And with the journalism, it's like, you got to tell the truth all the time. And so for creative writers, sometimes you feel yourself bumping up against that edge.
Plus your father would insist on it.
Well, that's right, that's right. But in fiction, what I found was challenging, incredibly hard, is like, how do I get Holly across the room quickly in prose? And what I like about poetry is that you're always working with speed and economy, even when you're creating a languid effect. You're always tight and fast, and I love that.
The word dream appears often in your poems. How are the dreams of Elizabeth Alexander different from the dreams of Langston Hughes? I know that at times your dreams are personal and sometimes they're historical. Yeah.
Let's make a line. So there would be the dreams of Langston Hughes, often dreams deferred.
I dream a world.
But also exactly very, very broad dreams. When he flings his arm wide in the face of the sun and he's dreaming under a tree. Right. So it's both deferral but also something very grand and beautiful. And I think, of course, next of a writer, if we're moving historically, who's been very important to me, Gwendolyn Brooks, and of her poem Kitchenette Building, where she says, "We are things of dry hours and the involuntary plan, grayed in and gray. Dream makes a giddy sound, not strong like rent, feeding a wife, satisfying a man. But could a dream rise up through onion fumes and yesterday's garbage ripening in the halls?" So there's still that sense of, it's out there, but what is it? And dare we hope for it? And is it attainable? And I think that while neither one of those writers is talking about a racialized dream, I do think, of course, given when they're writing in history, that in large part, though anybody can intersect with it, they're talking about black people at those moments in history and their dreams. The way that I use dream in my work, which I think is part of those people coming before me and a whole lot of other people coming before me, is first of all in the very, very literal sense of, what does it mean to go into the literal dream world where we're not in control of our juxtaposition, we're not in control of what we put next to each other, we are surprised ourselves, our rational mind is not in control. And is that, I wondered, before I started writing a whole series of dream poems, a space that's kind of a free space of identity? But what I learned is that, of course, we're never outside of our identities. We're never not who we are. We are just always capable of being who we are in far more expansive ways. And I think that's what the strange juxtaposition of the dream world, and also just the very, very peculiar surprises of language, has been interesting for me to explore in the poems.
Okay. In your poem, Race, you write, what a strange thing is race, and family stranger still. Could you elaborate on this statement?
Well, that poem, I should probably read that poem.
Read it,
yeah.
Is that a way of you avoiding the family stranger still?
We'll get there.
Okay.
Race. Sometimes I think about Great Uncle Paul, who left Tuskegee, Alabama to become a forester in Oregon, and in so doing became fundamentally white for the rest of his life, except when he traveled without his white wife to visit his siblings, now in New York, now in Harlem, USA, just as pale-skinned, as straight-haired, as blue-eyed as Paul, and black. Paul never told anyone he was white. He just didn't say that he was black. And who could imagine an Oregon forester in 1930 as anything other than white? The siblings in Harlem each morning ensured no one confused them for anything other than what they were. Black. They were black. Brown-skinned spouses reduced confusion. Many others have told and not told this tale. When Paul came east alone, he was as they were, their brother. The poet invents heroic moments where the pale black ancestor stands up on behalf of the race. The poet imagines Great Uncle Paul in cool, sagey groves, counting rings in redwood trunks, imagines pencil markings in a ledger book, classifications, imagines a sidelong look from an ivory spouse who is learning her husband's caesuras. She can see silent spaces, but not what they signify, graphite markings in a forester's code. Many others have told and not told this tale. The one time Great Uncle Paul brought his wife to New York, he asked his siblings not to bring their spouses. And that is where the story ends. Ivory siblings who would not see their brother without their telltale spouses. What a strange thing is race, and family stranger still. Here a poem tells a story about race. So, you know, who we are within ourselves and in our families is larger than race. That's not to say that the category of race isn't huge and infinite and fascinating and what my day job is made of. That is to say, you know, studying African American literature, running a Department of African American Studies, thinking it is by far the most fascinating thing that anybody could be studying at the university, and the most fascinating and important work that I could be doing. The most important work as far as talking about the way that understanding this history and this tradition and these cultural contributions is the only path through which to begin to understand America. If you don't take that path, you don't understand the whole big picture. I really do believe that. But that said, we are larger than that. And so I think that, and families are each peculiar. I mean, perhaps that's, you know, that's Dickens, right? You know, so each in its own way. Families are peculiar.
Your poems. Tolstoy.
Tolstoy, thank you. Oh my goodness, thank you. I stand corrected.
Right. We'll have an open discussion.
No, family.
Okay.
Alana Karenina, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Your poems celebrate and explore city life. How do you handle gentrification as an African American poet? Might you see your work perhaps documenting a vanishing way of life?
Well, so I live in Connecticut. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and my father and I were just driving around today, and as we always do when I come back, you notice what's changed and what you can't believe that's changed. You know, I mean, U Street makes me faint. I mean, it's like it changes. I mean, profound, profound changes. So I'll read a poem. It's a new poem. And, you know, there's also a nostalgia that comes along with it. And I would say that in some ways, I'm a nostalgist, but I try to always pair that with another voice that comes in and interrupts that. This is just a tiny little poem in the new section of the book, but it just speaks to what you're, it's called In D.C. In D.C., there are black women with golden afros and African print jumpsuits. Sidewalks sizzle in summer, a languid, loving fizz. A hey girl hissing from the streets, ambient, hey girl on all sides. Walk up and down Georgia Avenue or Florida Avenue or Columbia Road. How you doing? Hey. You never know what you will miss when you leave, what will call you back, what will disappear forever, or what was never there, quite as you now see it, hear it, write it in memory's poem. So that addresses, I think.
Connected to that, in your poem Hostage, you write, I am from D.C., therefore responsible.
Uh-huh. He would love that poem.
Yes.
Let's continue our D.C. theme. Okay, so who remembers that, you know, the hostage crisis, that you know, so that's very dramatic when you're a child. You know, it's funny, I wonder if I even put that in this new and collected poems, not knowing if you were the only one who understood the importance of that poem. I think it's not in here.
Well, we'll come back to that.
We'll come back to it.
Well,
Okay.
let's focus on that for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
What poems did you decide to keep in and leave out?
Well, you know, it's funny. I almost don't remember which ones I put in. It's a fascinating experience to say, okay, well, now there's enough work to choose from to say, okay, we're sort of in the middle now. This is hopefully mid-career, so let's see what's been done so far. For me, it felt like sweeping the desk clean in a wonderful way, of just saying, okay, you know, put it all in one book, and now you're free to be whoever you might need to be next in your poetry. And I don't know who that is, because I do not have one single poem outside of this. I haven't written a single poem since I finished putting this book together. And some of that is almost becoming a conscious thing to say, just wait until it's time to be in a new place. So in going through and thinking about, there's my sense of just the poems that I love, but that's sometimes extremely, extremely quirky. I have a little bit of a sense from people who have taught the work over the years. What are some of the ones that people like to teach? So you want the book to have a kind of a utility. I wanted it to have formal range. So for example, to have more than one prose poem and more than one found poem to show that those weren't just fluky moments, that that's actually something that I'm interested in. But it was a very, very hard and mysterious process, making the piles and taking things in and out. And at the end of the day, I imagine that this is the first reading that I've done since this book is really hot off the presses. So I imagine there'll be many moments where there'll be something I want to turn to, something that I love, something quirky, and I'll find that it won't be there. Yeah.
We lost 3 women writers this year, Lucille Clifton, Carolyn Rogers, and I. What contribution did you see these women making to American poetry, and did they have any influence on your life and work?
Well, when you think about those 3 mighty poets, each with very, very, very distinct poetics, and very, very, their work doesn't remind you of each other's at all, not in any way, shape, or form. So, for example, the poems of I, my interest in the persona poem, you know, you can't write persona poems when I started writing them and not know that I had been doing them and writing in these personae that many people felt surprised that a black woman would take on, because she did not usually write in the voice, as it were, of an African American woman. And that was a very, very audacious thing for her to let her imagination have that kind of wonderful openness, although those of us who write poems know that we're all that open. It's only the world that says you're only supposed to write out of your exact identity. Carolyn Rogers, her incredible sense of musicality and what she represented as an exemplar of the Black arts movement. All of that sort of space clearing that said, here, we're going to move the way for Black writers to write in whatever voices they need to. But the one that I really would want to talk about is Lucille Clifton, who was my friend and one of my poetry mothers, and just one of the most wonderful women in the world. A truly generous, a truly visionary, a truly funny, and a ravishingly gifted poet who was modest in inverse proportion to her extraordinary genius. And she was underestimated for years and years. And one of the things that I thought about when she died, in reading, as so many of us were, reading her poems to each other, reading and talking and thinking about her, is that we have not even begun to measure the influence of this work on 21st century letters. It's brilliant work. But because it is small and swift and deceptively simple, people sometimes think that because the allusions are not going in 500 different directions and blah, 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 that there's not as much to it as there is.
Same thing that happened with Langston.
Absolutely, absolutely. But it's profound and it's central. And Kevin Young, my friend, our friend, who you know, who's a great poet and who's also an archival person at the library at Emory, where her papers are, said that there is tons of unpublished stuff, that there are extraordinary journals with spirit writing. I mean, that there's really, really incredible stuff that we haven't even had a look at yet. So I'm really looking forward to, and I know there'll be a lot of other soldier poets, the work of upholding her legacy. And of course, also, I'm sure that many of you here, I'm sure Myra, she was a local person in Columbia, Maryland. So she belonged to this area for many, many years as well. And I miss her terribly.
I'll mention this. I believe Kevin Young is coming soon to give a talk at the Phillips Collection
Great.
in a few months. Just two more questions, and I'll open it up for others who are here in the circle. In a few months, the AWP conference will be held in D.C. How are MFA programs shaping American literature, especially for people of color and new immigrants? Can one find or workshop the new American voice in the MFA program?
I think you can, and this is sort of anecdotal because I don't teach in an MFA program, and because I don't really teach poetry at the university. I'm not.
Let's connect common to this.
Yeah, I'm not as up on it as others are. But for example, my friend and Washington native Campbell McGrath, who teaches at Florida International University, talks about the reason he likes teaching there is that there are so many. Most of the students in that workshop, English is not their first language, and certainly is not the language of their parents. And so they are writing a new American poetry. If you think about workshops, I imagine at Queens College, which Kamiko Hahn runs, and at NYU, which is now, the writers there are Juno Diaz, Yusef Komanyaka, is Edwidge Stuntico teaching there?
She's down in Florida.
Is she in Florida?
Right.
But who's the other? It was Paul Marshall, and who's the other novelist there? Can't remember. But long and short of it is, when I was coming along, the MFA programs were white. I mean, literally, that's just the truth. They were almost completely fundamentally white as far as the students and the faculty, and that has changed enormously. In keeping with, I think, the ways that access to publishing has changed over the years as well.
My last question to you before I open up for discussion is, you chair a department. What's your writing space like? I mean, do you have this little academic corner here, and then, this is my space, I'm going to spread out for my poems? I mean, what's your writing space like?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. My writing space, one of the things that I thought chairing a department would do and I was willing to nobly sacrifice for 3 years, was completely flatten my creative life. I just thought, okay, for 3 years nothing's going to happen. But instead what I found is that it's made the little pockets of time much more precious, but also much more visible. I can see where they are. So that what that also means is that any ideas of a room of one's own and coming home to work at the desk with the flowers and the water and the blah, blah, that's out the window. So writing space is wherever there is a pocket, a visible pocket with a little tiny bit of air. That's where it is. So it could be at school, it could be at my desk at home, it could be, well, I don't lounge in cafes, but it could be in a cafe. It's sometimes in the car, though on the side of the road.
You know, when you say that, I just immediately thought of Mae Miller. She wouldn't resign the cafe.
It's only a matter of time, not a matter of style.
All right.
So it's wherever I can find it. It's when I'm actually traveling. Sometimes being en route to places is a really good way to find time. So, you know, that paradox of the more, and I found this as well when I had children, when I also thought, you know, I shall not write, and I found that when hungry children want to eat in the middle of the night, you can actually keep a hand free once you get practiced. And then bit by bit, things get done.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. You know, I look around the table and we have a number of poets, and you made a reference to Derek Walcott being your teacher, and I look at Kia Vazirani, Ritika Vazirani is our mother,
Yes.
and Ritika Vazirani was also taught by Derek Walcott.
Yep.
Any questions from all these many writers that are around, or are you going to write something when you leave here? We have performing artists, we have people who've written memoirs, we have, oh, no, okay. Any questions? Dad? You have a question, Joe?
Hi, how are you?
Hello, fine, thank you.
I enjoy your writings, but when you were talking about some of the areas, do you see yourself in your writings as you're writing, but more importantly, when you look back, like this collection spans 20 years, do you see yourself then, and do you see the changes? Because and the reason why I say that, some of the writings that I've done, people said they saw me in it, and I didn't see me at all until years later and looking back at it. So I wonder how you see yourself in your own works, present and past.
Yeah, I really don't, you know, I would say like a shark moving ever forward, except I'm not like a shark. But the moving ever forward part, I look back, I see her, and I say there she is, but I don't contemplate, and I don't try to taxonomize it at all, because I really think, and it's one of the things that I learned from Walcott actually. A large person, a large poet, a great poet, but someone who was utterly humble every morning before the blank page. And as he would say, you know, in the metaphors of St. Lucia, that the waves have washed everything away in the night. And there you are with the sand again, just washed clean. And that's your work, that's your job. So I feel that too much retrospective action interferes with what it takes to do what sometimes feels like walking out into the ocean, and that's where the energy goes. So I don't think about it too much.
Thanks, Joy. Rich?
So I got a question. With the rise of with MFA programs, you have a lot of writers that teach in college, and just as a father and somebody who teaches in school, it always makes me wonder now, and I asked Ethelbert this too, what is the role of the writer in society, and particularly in the school system? And I wonder, what are your opinions on that? Not even necessarily college, but in the lower grades, because you don't teach primarily poetry, I think you recognize the importance of teaching.
Yeah.
And in my childhood, writers weren't visible presence in my life at all. Even though books were visible, and even though my mom and my folks read a lot of books, writers weren't. And I'm wondering, what do you think, if there's a change in role and responsibilities of a writer now, with a few teaching the school programs, or if you think there should be a shift in the writer's responsibility to actually be a presence in the community, the way I imagine Langston Hughes was, in a way sort of that I know that, you know, you have, and Ethelbert has been, and Lucille Clifton has been, and sort of like a huge legacy of black writers have been in my life, but sort of in my 16 and up life, not my childhood.
That's interesting. Well, you know, one of the things is Terry Cross's program at the Folger still in place? That's something that I've not on trips when I'm able to when I come home. It's a great program, and I don't know who funds it, but there are, so as I understand it, there are people who are the poetry educators who, you do that for her? All right, well then what am I telling you for? But to tell all of you, and then a writer's coming through town, through the Folger, or not through the Folger, I just call her up and say, I'm here. And then the poetry educator takes the books and goes to the classroom and works with the kids on the poems, and then the poet comes and visits as a kind of a climax to the whole work. And I just feel like that is a simple, perfect program that could be easily replicated in any city and would be a way, not to say that all cities, I mean, there are people who live here all the time too, but that would be a great thing to have. My kids are almost 11 and 12, and so a lot of my life as a poet in the community has to do with their schools, our neighborhoods, their friends, and that sort of thing. And going into their classrooms year after year and going into other classrooms year after year. And I guess the one thing I could say out of the many things is that, as we know, children know what to do with poetry. Children know how to make poetry. My 10-year-old, I mean, he is very clever, but he just makes poems. He just says, he just does it. He's facile in that way that children like rhymes, they like rhythm, they play with language, it's inherent. And they also haven't been taught, as some are but some aren't, they haven't been taught to have anxiety around the art form in the way that some people are later on, even that when I deal with them in the university. I find that it takes much more work to get our graduate students even to study poetry as opposed to studying fiction, because they think that they know what to do with fiction better than they know what to do with poetry. But kids are still just listening, I think, which is a wonderful thing.
Let me talk about you as a kid with your father here. When you were growing up, not just writing, but you grew up around African-American art, visual art, and I wonder how that had an impact. Because when I look at your books by Grey Wolf, I'm assuming you selected some of these prints.
All of them.
All of them. I mean,
yeah.
just talk about the importance of just being around those type of images, you know, Romare Bearden, you know, by the bathroom. You know?
Yeah, yeah. It was a great thing to grow up in the midst of visual sensitivity. My mother is very artistic. Her uncle was the painter Charles Alston, a great painter. And so that work and the work of others, we had actual art on the walls, but also, and I've written about this in The Black Interior, my mother's aesthetic touch meant that she arranged spaces and objects in a way. We have shelves in our living room with seashells and feathers and eggshells and just curious objects that she's put together in a way that says, this is common and this is beautiful, and maybe this is even a little magical. Maybe there's some power here. And Mommy, you know, I said to Mommy, you make altars. And she's like,
don't tell anyone.
That's not her lexicon. But to me, those were analogous to the power of making poems, of bringing together common things and understanding the generative magic that they can have. So that was really.
I can feel your father feel like that's how he was caught.
Very, very.
Spell number 7.
That's right. Now you know.
Now you know.
And also, I think that, you know, my dad, heretofore silent, has a way with words and a way with language and a way with the vernacular as well as with the King's English, and all of that kind of talking and storytelling that to me was very, very artful and beautiful. I mean, so many of us grow up with that, but I guess whatever little pixie made me a poet, that was what I paid attention to. So it felt like there was beauty everywhere. There was beauty in dinner. There was beauty in story, and there was beauty on the walls.
Let's take 2 more questions, and then I think
They
you
had a great big party down in Compton.
And also, actually, my father recited Paul Laurence Dunbar to me, so that is very important when I was growing up.
Yeah.
I have a kind of a 2-part question.
Mhm.
The first one is about Gwendolyn Brooks.
Mhm.
And if there, my first question is about Gwendolyn Brooks, and I know with your work with her and everything, and if you have 1 or 2 favorite poems by her and what you see the role of her work is. And then the second question goes on what Reginald Betts was saying, because I think of Brooks when I think of education and bringing writers along, in terms of what you think she might think about the situation today for young Black writers and the situation for them for publishing.
Okay, great. I'll answer it backwards. You know, I very consciously try to do like Gwendolyn Brooks did. So she was one of the most important poets to me as far as the poems, but also her example, who she was as a poet, is something that I always remember. So for example, anytime I ever saw her at a reading, she came with a tote bag of books, her own books, a full tote bag. And she would leave with the tote bag empty. She would give it to all the young people in the room or anybody who didn't have the money for a book, who would come in line and they hadn't bought a book. And she'd say, here, you should have this book. I have seen her as an elderly woman sign books for 3 hours. And there are times when I don't like remembering that legacy, when I'm sitting here like, Miss Brooks signed the books for 3 hours. But you know what? Those people bought your book. And those people cared enough about your poems to buy your book. And she honored them in that way. She would, without, you know, sometimes you don't need a big fancy armature to be generous and make things happen. So I've tried to follow the way that she would, you know, there was a story about how a driver who, at one of her readings, was telling her he had just gotten out of prison and he had gotten this driving job and he was trying to get himself together and these were his aspirations, and she signed over her honorarium check. Or of the young people who she said, you know, what you need to change your lives, you need to go to Africa. And she wrote them a check. So just that kind of, it's a tithing. It's a tithing to community. And it's a tithing to community that's defined very, very broadly. And so that is a really high standard to remember and to try to live up to. As far as favorite poems, to me, part of her genius is, I guess, her poem In the Mecca, which is almost a book-length poem. She didn't usually write in epic form. She wrote much shorter forms. This is a poem that she worked on for decades about a decrepit apartment building in Chicago, the Mecca building, and she tells the story of something terrible that happens in that community and is really quite profoundly asking Black communities to look to themselves and say, who are we and what are we doing? But it's episodic, and it's beautifully written. So I like that because I think it's a great poem, but also because she did something, she never continued to sound like a version of herself. And I think that's very, very important to remember. And then, golly gosh, so many, but you know, The Bean Eaters is a great poem. Really, literally almost every poem she's written is a gem. And I think that for the 20th century, I put her as the poetic genius, ahead of Eliot, ahead of Lowell, who's her contemporary, ahead of, she's #1 for the 20th century, which I have to keep saying because I want people to stop and think about that.
Maybe we should stop right there. But the
Could
last
I
question.
ask
Okay.
For all of you writers and poets in the room, this is a story that I'd like her to tell to you, and it's about her inaugural poem, and it is the stanza, "A woman and her son wait for a bus." What you heard back from an elementary school teacher.
Oh, well, that's a good closing question because thank you. One of the cool things about writing a poem that has this kind of exposure is that I heard from lots of people. And what was cool about that was not only that they were responding to this poem, but once again, they were responding to poetry. And that many of the people who wrote me, and this I know because many of them told me, do not have books of poems in their houses. Okay, these are not like poetry people, the people who I'm normally talking to. These are people who responded to a poem. So there were many, and I'll just tell two. In that one that Dad points out, a woman and her son wait for the bus. A farmer considers the changing sky. A teacher says, take out your pencils, begin. And a woman wrote me who was a second grade teacher, and she told me a long story about how, like, we're not allowed to have TVs in the school, but I snuck a TV in for the inaugural because it was such an important day, and even though I would never let second graders watch TV, but they had to watch it today, so she has this contraband TV, she puts it up, they watch the inaugural, and she said, and when you read your poem, when you came to the line, a teacher says, take out your pencils, begin. This is at the inaugural in real time. All of the kids picked up their pencils and started writing. So to me, what that says is poetic utterance was true and real to them. And I just think that's very, very wonderful. And then another thing that was very important to me is I got a letter from the head of the United Farm Workers movement, who wrote and sent me a UFW flag and said, thank you for using the word lettuce. Because, and the line is, the people who laid the train tracks, raised the bridges, picked the cotton and the lettuce. She said, because with that word, you remember those of us who work so hard to feed the nation. Thank you for that word. And so I think, again, it's about the poem, but moreover, it is about the power of a word and what it means to choose them carefully. And so I hope that's some of the work that poetry does as well.
And I will end on the word that I began with, fabulous.
Thank
you all. Thank you, the Aspen Institute. I believe
if there are further questions, feel free. We have a little more time.
we have a little more time? Oh, great. Okay. I was looking at, okay. Renee?
I'm sure you've been asked this question so many times, but how did you get the call, and how did you feel when you were asked, could you write this poem? Would you write this poem?
Yeah, I've been asked that question, but I will answer it again. I got the call from the inaugural, I wish I remembered the gentleman's name, from the inaugural transition team person. And, you know, poets had been handicapping back and forth. You know, like, is he going to have a poem? Then there was the day when he was photographed with Walcott's collected poems outside of his kid's school, and we're like, yes, he's going to do it. If anyone's going to do it, he's going to do it. He's going to do it for us. So then, of course, we were all thinking about who's going to be, who's going to be, who's going to be, and there were, you know, many, 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 many different thoughts. So I was just hoping that it would happen, period. But I was immediately, you know, I mean, I screamed. I called my parents. I screamed. And I screamed. I said, when Mom answered the phone, I said, Mom, Aretha Franklin! All I could say.
With Pat.
That's right. So, because that was, you know, I was on stage next to Aretha Franklin. That was very exciting. But then, you know, sobriety immediately set in. Because that was December 17th. So, you know, there was work to do. And so that then began a very, 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 very intensive work period in the middle of the holidays, but just with a kind of absolutism to it. So that was, you know, had to stay very much on point for that. And that's where a lot of the challenges of writing a poem that, I mean, once again, usually the way this takes us around to the beginning, we write I write for the page, and then I hope it makes its way out in different ways, but it has to succeed on the page. That's my medium, that's my material, that's what I'm doing. But to think this is a poem that most people will never read. You know, most people will never read it, relative to how many people will hear it. So what's that about? And also, this isn't a quirky, you know, esoteric dream poem. I mean, it does have to have a little bit of a responsibility to some idea of what it means to be broad-reaching. But yet, when you think too hard about the broad-reaching, you can write a dreadful poem. When you're too busy anticipating, I think what we poets spend all of our time doing, I tell anyone who I teach, never think about audience. You don't know who they are. You don't know what they want. Never think about them. It's death to a poem. But here I did have to have a sense that it was going to live in a way that I knew about. But that was where it was good, you know, the lessons of the parents and the grandparents. It's like, you know, sit down and do your homework. So then it was done.
Good question. Beverly?
I'm Beverly Kirk. This is a quirky question, but I just have to ask it.
Mm-hmm.
You were part of Dr. Gates' Faces in America program on PBS back in February. What was it like finding out you're descended from Charlemagne?
Well, yes. So Henry Louis Gates has this genealogy series, and and he put me on it. And I knew my mother's a historian, and she'd done a great deal of family research, and I've always been interested in family stories, so I knew a lot. But one of the things that I did not know is that my 32nd great-grandfather is Charlemagne. I guess, you know, it was a great and interesting project, but my job in that project, and I don't know if it made its way all the way into the final version, was to say, A, Black people are not surprised that we have white people in our ancestry. That's American history. That is not surprising. That's not like, whoo. And that also doesn't make us not Black if we happen to have more identifiable Caucasian ancestors than we do ancestors from Africa who are Native American. So, like, let's sort of do away with that. And then secondly, you know, to have this king, and actually it's Charlemagne and his mistress, so I'm not a legitimate descendant. I'm an illegitimate descendant. But what to me is interesting about that line is that when it goes down, and then it goes down to King John of England, and it's straight down, and then it, you know, comes down further to, you know, Dr. Gates showed me this beautiful manor in England that is a museum now, and he's like, that's your eighth grandfather, that's yours. But my point is, that's not mine. And why isn't that mine? Because the moment that he had children with a Black woman that he owned, then there was no longer any access to that. And everything turned. And so, and that's okay. Again, that's American history. I'm not waiting for the scepter or the crown or the jewels or any of that. But I think it's not a jolly narrative. It's a narrative that is about violence and oppression and coercion and human beings owning other human beings and Americans building their wealth on the backs of other human beings. So what I think is really fascinating is to see here Charlemagne, and here, as he also showed me, are the ownership papers for, on my father's side, my Jamaican fourth grandfather, when he was 2 years old, valued at 40 pounds on a ledger of a Jamaican plantation, on a page where everyone on the page is a baby. 1 year and a half, 35 pounds. 1 year, 2 months, 32 pounds, 50 pence. You know, the incredible detail and language of slavery. And there it was, and that's me too. So to me, what I do think is really fascinating, because those were two things, I didn't know that before either, was the bringing together that's part of the interesting and contradictory and complicated and very, very rich American story.
Thank you.
All right. Sarah?
Thank you. My name's Sarah Browning. I'm director of Split This Rock Poetry Festival.
Oh, great. Oh, we corresponded once. Yes, hi.
Hi, thank you. And we're at a very different moment, even though it's such a short period of time since you wrote this important poem. And so I wanted to ask you to just elaborate more on the social role of poetry and what you see that poetry can do at this moment when we're so divided and our country is at such a crucial moment.
Yeah, I think we are so divided, and I think we are at a crucial moment. I don't think this is the first such moment. So I think if you look back, and even if you just look back at presidents, at any moment that a president put forth a progressive agenda, you know, everybody wasn't, I mean, my dad can tell you much more about this than I can, but did everyone love Lyndon Johnson? You know, was everybody down with the Great Society? I mean, there was tremendous violent unrest, and as there always is at moments where, you know, we're trying to move toward change. So while I do think there are some particularities about now, I'd want to put it in a longer line. I think also what I'd say about the longer line is that I think that poetry needs to keep doing what it's always been done. I mean, I think that the ways in which poetry needs to be a true voice and not a voice with an agenda and not a voice that ever lies, a voice that sees more than we can take in your average moment in the day, a voice or an eye, to mix my metaphors, that widens, that looks beyond, that remembers. That is the social function of poetry, which is poetry doing what it's always done. I think what poetry's always done, the poet Marie Howe, whose work I really love, and she's such a smart thinker about poetry, she said in an interview recently What is poetry? Song and story. That is what we do. That is what human beings do. What happened today? Where'd you come from? What are you doing? We tell each other our stories, and in poetry, we do it in song. And that for as long as there's been poetry, it has been peoples telling each other the story of the tribe. And that it's, I think, always with a keen sense of history, right? Here we're living now on the rocky shoals of such and such a place. How do we get here? Why are we here? Can we stay here? Do we tell each other stories, like the beautiful children's book Ferdinand, when all the little mousies are doing their work for the winter, and there's one mouse, Ferdinand, who says, I didn't bring corn, I didn't bring water, but I have the stories that will tell us who we are while we do our work and that will keep us warm in the wintertime. So I think that in some ways, it's a version of the same thing that's always been there. I guess when I think about the social role, what I would hope can always be pushed is the teaching of poetry, opportunities to present poetry where you don't expect it, which I think was really great about the president choosing a poet for the inaugural. Didn't have to do it. That you don't have to go to a library or a book cafe or to see a poetry reading, that poetry readings can happen in so many different kinds of spaces. I think that's part of the work of literary activism right now that's really useful and important.
Mm-hmm. You had a question?
Yeah, it struck me that you had, I'm sorry. My name's Kia Penso, I'm a writer. It struck me that you had an unusual experience in standing up and really presenting what you could call an official poem, which is an experience that would have been a lot more common up until about the end of the 18th century, at least in the English and American literary traditions, where you'd have a poem if somebody died or if it was somebody's birthday, or you paid compliments and that kind of thing. And there's also, right up to about that same period, I was thinking about this especially in connection with what you were saying about what poetry does, a long tradition of very forceful and sometimes virulent political invective in poetry, going all the way back to the Romans at least. And I was thinking that in those activities, which are sort of political fighting, it's like what people did instead of keep blogs. I see a role that poetry had that it no longer has. But I wonder, as one pushes the idea of getting poetry more visible in life, is there profit to be had from looking at those earlier models of poetry as public speech?
Well, definitely. I mean, and I think you've laid it out very nicely. But of course, also we have to rethink our times and our media, and be flexible about, what's the equivalent. I mean, I'm just making this up. If to have poems on Facebook, let's say. I mean, what is that public sphere, and what does it mean to put a certain kind of language out into that public sphere? To think about the ways that we communicate evolve as human society evolves. I think that's the interesting challenge. But I like the way that poetry always kind of comes back to the bone. It's the human voice. Even when it's the human voice speaking individually, it's a human voice that has, it is informed by the ages, always, even if that's not visible in a poem. And I think it's also the human voice meant to communicate across voids with precision. And I think that is a shining example, always, for all of the other kinds of communication and discourse that people engage in.
Did you want to read another poem?
I can read another poem.
And then you.
Yes, I will happily read a poem. Since we're talking about politics, this is a poem called Rally, and it was written during the presidential campaign. And there are a few poems in this new book that emerged from that very intense time of the presidential campaign. And so they are not poems that are about President Obama in an explicit kind of way. They're meant to fan out into something larger. But they also were occasioned by the extraordinary campaign that we all went through. So we're in October 2008, and there was a rally in Miami. And the poem is called Rally. The awesome weight of the world had not yet descended upon his athlete's shoulders. I saw someone light but not feathered jog up to the rickety stage like a jock off the court, played my game, did my best, and the silent crowd listened and dreamed. The children sat high on their parents' shoulders. Then the crowd made noise that gathered and grew until it was loud and was loud as the sea. What it meant or would mean was not yet fixed, nor could be, though human beings ever tilt toward.
Thank you. Okay. Donna, you had a question?
I do, although I'm sort of lost after hearing that poem. I have to collect my thoughts. I'm Donna Christensen. I'm a former educator, but much more involved in a range of other things now. But tying in with your earlier comments about having poetry in the schools and bringing it in with the programs that you've referred to, and then to Facebook and other social media, there's an opportunity, and part of the problem is, I think, poets aren't organized. You know, you don't have a union, you don't have an association, you don't have somebody out there promoting and saying, okay, every time there's an opportunity, we ought to have poetry there for the exposure. There's a huge rally coming up. I think it's going to turn out to be huge. The thing that Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert are doing. I hope there will be poetry, and I hope some of the poets in this room will contact those people and see that there is. It's a wonderful opportunity.
It would be great, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, I just
and
heard about
and
that
I think
yesterday.
they'd both be fully supportive of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to find a way to look for those opportunities and make sure that everybody has the opportunity to have poetry in their lives.
Absolutely. I think that that most of that responsibility is not with poets themselves, though. I think it's people saying that this is what they want and asking for it. Because, believe me, poets hustle. Don't we hustle? Poets hustle to try to get our little poems anywhere we can. That is what we do. And not that we don't know that that's a way of life, but I think that for others who have venues to ask for it and include it is a nice thing too.
Talking about that, talk about your relationship with Grey Wolf, because that's a very important company.
Yeah. Well, Grey Wolf Press, and they make all my books. You asked about the covers, too. I've chosen all the covers. Could I see this one for a moment? This was the first edition of the Venus Hottentot.
It's University of Virginia.
And this is University of Virginia. And this is why you have to choose your covers. I think you've heard me talk about this. So this is a painting called Ballet Dancer by Charles Alston. It hangs in my living room. I love it. The first, and the Venus Hottentot, the title poem of this book, is a story about a Southern African woman in the early part of the 19th century who was exhibited caged and nude in the private balls and circuses of London and Paris. People wanted to see her behind in her genitalia as a way of talking about essence and racial difference, and she died when she was 25 after being experimented upon by a French scientist named Georges Cuvier. 100% tragic story. So, and that's the lead poem. I give the book to the University Press of Virginia, and they say, here's the cover we suggest. And it had scallop shells alluding to Venus rising out of the sea. It was baby aspirin pink, the cover, and it was alluding to, you know, Botticelli's Venus rising up out of the sea. So, you know, that's an extreme story, but the point is, I thought one must take matters into one's own hands. And thus began just a wonderful project that my presses have all been cooperative with, of feeling like book covers were an opportunity to just present, because many are beautifully designed without works of art per se on them, but I wanted there to be works of art, and works of art by African American artists who I felt were underexposed, because I thought that's just the little job these books can do in the world when people see them out. To see this painting by Carrie James Marshall, and this painting by William Johnson, and this painting by Washington school teacher Alma Thomas, Wind and Crepe Myrtle. whose work is actually now hanging in the White House. One thing that's interesting is that there's more black art in the White House now, including when you see the bust of Martin Luther King in the newly designed Oval Office, it is a Charles Alston bust. So that's just something you might want to know. And it's because it's a small press, and because they're devoted to poetry, and because they are not commercial, so therefore they can sort of always stick to their principles. Working with them and being a poet with the people at Grey Wolf it's a joy and a privilege, because you get exactly the book that you meant to make, and I'm just very grateful to them for that.
Okay. Any last questions? Oh, okay.
I simply wanted to know, are you participating in the National Book Festival tomorrow at the Poetry Hotel?
I am, yes. Time for a commercial interruption. I am tomorrow, in fact. But here's what's even cooler. My mother, who's a historian, is also participating at the National Book Festival. So we will both be presenting. She will be presenting from her work, Parallel Lives, which is a story of, among other things, this extraordinary early African-American diplomatic couple that people don't know enough about. And I'll be reading tomorrow. So that'll be on the Mall. And it's in the morning. I think it's at 10.
Thank you. Okay, we'll do this again. I'm going to say fabulous.
Oh, thank you, Ethelbert.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And you're here to sign books. And
yeah, totally.
We're here to sign books, and I want to thank once again the Aspen Institute for being our host. Thank you for creating this roundtable. This is so good. Look at you. This is really good.